She had promised herself she would not cry. Not today. Not at his graveside, where half of London stood watching her with the particular hunger reserved for tragedy that belongs to someone else. But when the vicar closed his book and the first clump of earth struck the coffin lid, something in her chest simply gave way, and she wept. Not for the husband she had buried, but for the years she had spent believing she would never again be looked at the way one man, standing at the edge of the crowd in a black greatcoat, was looking at her now. Welcome back to the Duke's Revenge, where the coldest hearts burned the hottest, and where the women's society tried to silence become the most dangerous forces in England. I have missed you, truly. It has been some time since we last sat together like this, and I want you to know how much I have thought of this community during that quiet stretch. Today I am so glad to be back with a story I have been saving for exactly this moment. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I love seeing how far this little corner of the internet reaches, and after being away for a while, I find myself missing that connection more than ever. Tonight's story is about a young woman who was married at 19 to a man twice her age, widowed before she turned 22, and left to navigate London society with nothing but a small house in Bloomsbury, a modest annuity, and the unshakable label of the poor widow Ashby, spoken always with a particular curl of the lip that suggested pity and contempt in equal measure. It is also the story of a man who loved her before her wedding, through her marriage and across the long silence of her mourning, and who finally returned to London with a fortune, a title, and 7 years of restraint about to break. There is a moment late in this story when she will find something that changes everything she believed about the years she spent alone. I promise you, it is worth the wait. Let me take you back to the autumn of 1854, to a graveyard in the rain, where a widow in black stood very still, and a duke she barely remembered watched her from beneath the bare branches of an oak tree, and neither of them yet understood what was about to begin. Winifred Hartley had been a bride at 19, a wife for 3 years, and now at 22 she was something society had no kind word for at all. A widow. Worse, a young widow, which seemed to invite a particular kind of scrutiny, as though her grief were suspect simply by virtue of how many years she might be expected to feel it. The funeral of Mr. Josiah Ashby had been a small affair, attended more out of obligation than sentiment, for he had been a man well past 60 when he married her, a wool merchant who had made a comfortable fortune and wanted, in his final years, a young wife to manage his household and, though he had never said it aloud, to be looked at across his dinner table, a pretty ornament purchased with the only currency a man of his sort possessed. Winifred had not loved him. She had not hated him either. He had been for 3 years simply a fact of her life, kind enough in his way, distant in every way that mattered, and entirely uninterested in the woman beneath the ornament. When he died of an apoplexy in his sleep, she had felt something closer to relief than grief, and the shame of that feeling had settled into her like a stone she carried everywhere. Now, standing at the edge of his grave in a rain that had soaked through her mourning veil an hour ago, she felt the weight of every eye upon her. The wool merchants who had been Josiah's associates, their wives who had never quite accepted her, a vicar's daughter with no dowry to speak of, who had married above her station and was now, in their eyes, getting precisely what such ambition deserved. And further back, half hidden beneath the bare branches of an old oak, a man in a black greatcoat whom she did not recognize at first, and who did not approach. It was her sister Margaret who noticed him. "Winnie," Margaret's gloved hand tightened on her arm. "Do you see who that is?" "I cannot see anything through this veil, Margaret, and I confess I have very little interest in society gossip at my own husband's funeral." "That," Margaret said in the hushed, scandalized whisper she reserved for only the most delicious information, "is the Duke of Hawthorne." Winifred's breath caught, just slightly, just for a moment, before she steadied it. The name meant something to her, though she had spent 7 years training herself not to let it mean anything at all. Cedric. Lord Cedric Aldous Hawthorne, as he had been when she knew him, before his elder brother's death had made him duke of an estate so vast that even the wool merchants whispered about it with something like reverence. She had not seen him since she was 15 years old. "He has been abroad for years," Margaret continued, unable to help herself even now, even here. "Some say the continent, some say further, India perhaps, or the Americas. No one has seen him in London society since before your wedding. And now he simply appears at a funeral. Your husband's funeral, Winnie. I am quite certain," Winifred said, her voice carefully flat, "that the Duke of Hawthorne has rather more pressing concerns than the funeral of a wool merchant's wife." But when she allowed herself just once to lift her gaze toward the oak tree, she found that he was not looking at the coffin or the vicar or the assembled mourners. He was looking at her, and he had not looked away. The weeks that followed buried Winifred in a different sort of grief than she had expected. Not sorrow for Josiah exactly, but the slow, suffocating realization of precisely how little she had been left with, and precisely how little that would now protect her. The house in Bloomsbury was modest, but respectable, and the annuity Josiah had arranged would keep her in coal and bread, but it would not keep her in society, not that society had ever fully welcomed her. She had married a man of trade, however successful, and the families who had once condescended to acknowledge her now found it considerably easier not to. It was her mother-in-law, Mrs. Constance Ashby, who made the situation plainest. "You understand, of course," Constance said, seated in Winifred's small drawing-room, with the particular rigidity of a woman who had never once, in 60 years, permitted herself to relax in another person's presence, "that you cannot expect to be received in the same circles you once were. Josiah's name opened certain doors. Without him, those doors will not remain open for a woman with no fortune of her own and no family connections worth the mention." "I have never asked to be received anywhere, Mrs. Ashby." "No," Constance agreed, with the faint, cold smile of a woman scoring a point. "You never did have ambitions in that direction, did you? Which is, I suppose, fortunate, given how things have turned out. A young widow with no children and a small income is not a figure of any consequence, my dear. You would do well to accustom yourself to a quiet life. Quiet and small." It was not cruelty exactly. Constance Ashby did not deal in the dramatic cruelties of villains in novels. Hers was a quieter, more devastating sort, the cruelty of cold facts delivered without malice, because malice would at least suggest Winifred mattered enough to be the target of it. Constance simply did not think of her as mattering at all. "I shall manage perfectly well, Mrs. Ashby," Winifred said, and meant it, though she was not entirely certain it was true. "I am sure you will manage," Constance said, rising to take her leave. "Managing is, after all, what women of your sort do." After she had gone, Winifred sat alone in her small drawing-room as the light faded, and allowed herself for the first time since the funeral to think of the man beneath the oak tree. She had not seen him again. There had been no card left, no inquiry made. Perhaps Margaret had been wrong about who it was. Perhaps it had simply been a stranger drawn by curiosity to the spectacle of a funeral, the way strangers sometimes were. But she remembered his eyes. Even through the rain and the veil, she remembered them, and the way they had not moved from her face, not once, in all the long minutes the vicar spoke of ashes and dust and the certainty of resurrection. She told herself it meant nothing. She had told herself that about Cedric Hawthorne for 7 years, and she had, for the most part, succeeded in believing it. Now it is worth pausing here to understand something about the world Winifred was living in, because the predicament she found herself in was not unusual, and that is precisely what made it so dangerous. In 1850s England, a widow's social position depended almost entirely on 2 things: the wealth her husband left behind and the family connection she could claim through either her birth or her marriage. A wealthy widow, particularly one with property in her own right, could become remarkably independent. She could manage her own affairs, refuse remarriage if she chose, and command a degree of social respect that single or married women rarely enjoyed. But a widow of modest means, with no land, no significant family, and a husband whose own family had little reason to support her, occupied a precarious middle ground. She was neither a maiden under her father's protection nor a wife under her husband's name. She was, in the eyes of society, simply unaccounted for. This is precisely the position Winifred found herself in. Her father, a country vicar, had died 3 years prior. Her mother had remarried and moved to Yorkshire, with little room in her new household for a grown daughter. Her sister Margaret was herself only recently married, to a curate with a small living and even smaller income. Winifred's annuity from Josiah's estate, some £60 a year, was enough to maintain her small house and a single servant, but it placed her firmly in the category of women who were, as Constance Ashby had so delicately put it, of no consequence. When Winifred faced the cold dismissal of her mother-in-law, she was facing the particular precariousness of a woman whose only real protection, a husband's name, had been stripped away, leaving her with status but no power, respectability but no resources, and a society that had already decided, before she had even finished her year of mourning, exactly how much attention she was worth. It was nearly 3 weeks after the funeral when the first invitation arrived. Winifred almost did not open it. She had received so few since Josiah's death, and those she had received were largely from women like Mrs. Ashby's circle, the sort of correspondence that arrived dripping with condescension disguised as concern. But this envelope was different. The paper was heavier, the seal pressed with a crest she did not immediately recognize, though something about it tugged at a memory she could not quite name. Inside was a single card written in a hand she did recognize, though it had been 7 years since she had last seen it, in the margins of a borrowed book of poetry, scrawled with the careless confidence of a young man who had never once doubted that he would have everything he wanted in life. Miss Hartley, I understand the period of strict mourning has only recently concluded, and I would not presume upon it were the matter not, I think, of some importance to you. My estate manager has recently discovered certain papers belonging to your late father, the Reverend Mr. Hartley, among documents acquired with the purchase of the old vicarage living at Marrowfield some years past. I believe they may include correspondence and personal effects you would wish to have returned. I would be glad to call upon you at your convenience, or to have them delivered, whichever you should prefer. Your servant, Hawthorne Winifred, read the card 3 times. It was, on its surface, an entirely innocuous communication, the kind of polite, practical correspondence that passed between members of society constantly, concerning matters of property and inheritance and the small administrative debris that followed a person through life and beyond it. There was nothing in it that could not be read aloud in a crowded drawing-room without raising an eyebrow. And yet, my estate manager has recently discovered certain papers, the old vicarage living at Marrowfield, her father's parish, the home she had grown up in, sold years ago when her father's health failed, and the family moved to a smaller house nearer her mother's people. Cedric Hawthorne's family had held the living at Marrowfield. She remembered that now, the way one remembers a fact that had simply never seemed important until this exact moment. The Hawthorne estate had owned the land, the church, the vicarage, everything. He had not needed to write to her at all. A man of his position could have had any papers concerning a deceased country vicar's effects quietly disposed of, or forwarded through a solicitor, or simply left in a drawer, to be forgotten. Instead, he had written to her himself, personally, within weeks of her husband's death. She sat with the card in her lap for a long time before she allowed herself to write a response, and when she did, she kept it as brief, as careful, and as unremarkable as his own had been. Your Grace, I should be very grateful to have my father's papers returned, and would welcome you to call at your convenience. I am generally at home in the mornings. W. Hartley. She did not sign it Mrs. Ashby, though it was technically her correct name now. She told herself it was simply habit, that she had been Winifred Hartley far longer than she had been anyone's wife. She did not examine the choice any further than that. The Duke of Hawthorne arrived 3 days later at 10:30 in the morning, in a plain black carriage that drew no attention whatsoever on Winifred's quiet Bloomsbury Street, and Winifred suspected, the moment she saw it through the window, that this was entirely deliberate. Her single servant, a stout, no-nonsense woman named Hodge, who had come with the house and had outlasted 3 previous tenants, announced him with the particular flustered formality of a servant entirely unaccustomed to dukes. "His Grace the Duke of Hawthorne, my lady." And then he was simply there, filling the doorway of her small drawing-room in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size. Though he was tall, taller than she remembered, with the kind of broad-shouldered solidity that spoke of years spent somewhere that was not a London drawing-room, and everything to do with the sheer quiet weight of his presence. He wore black, still, though whether for mourning or simply by preference she could not tell. His hair was darker than she remembered, his jaw sharper, and there was a scar, thin, pale, barely visible, along one cheekbone that had not been there when he was 18. "Miss Hartley?" He bowed correctly, formally, with no more warmth than the situation strictly required. "Thank you for receiving me." "Your Grace." She rose and curtsied, and was grateful, distantly, for the years of practice that allowed her hands to remain steady. Then, before she could stop herself, "Forgive me. It is Mrs. Ashby now, Your Grace, if we are to be correct about it." Something flickered across his face, the faintest trace of colour, there and gone. "Forgive me. I confess the name does not come easily. I have known you as Miss Hartley considerably longer than the alternative, and I find old habits are not so easily set aside. I shall endeavour to do better." "Please, sit. May I offer you tea?" "Thank you, no. I shan't trouble you long." He did not sit either, though she had gestured toward the chair opposite hers. He remained standing near the door, as though uncertain of his welcome, which struck her as faintly absurd. A duke, uncertain of his welcome, in a Bloomsbury drawing-room the size of his own dressing-room, surely. From beneath his coat he produced a small leather case, worn at the corners, tied with faded ribbon. "These were found among papers relating to the Marrowfield living. I believe they belonged to your father." Winifred took the case. Her fingers brushed his. The briefest contact, gloved hand against gloved hand, and she felt it the way one feels the first chill before a storm. A small shock that travelled up her arm and settled somewhere just beneath her ribs. "Thank you," she said, and busied herself with the ribbon to give her hands something to do. Inside were letters. Her father's hand, dozens of them, correspondence with the bishop, with parishioners, with old friends from his university days. And beneath them, smaller, more worn, a child's drawing, clearly her own work from decades ago, of their old garden at Marrowfield. A pressed flower, brittle with age. A letter in her father's hand, addressed simply to "my dearest Winifred," dated the year before his death, which she had never received. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. "Forgive me," she said, turning away slightly, blinking hard. "I had not expected—" "There is nothing to forgive." His voice had changed, softened, just slightly, in a way that made it somehow more difficult to bear than if he had remained perfectly formal. "I would not have had it delivered by post. Some things ought to be handed over, not simply sent." Winifred looked up at him then, really looked, for the first time since he had entered the room, and found him watching her with an expression she could not immediately place. Not pity, which she had braced herself for and had grown so accustomed to receiving from everyone else. Something else, something careful and old and very tightly controlled. "You did not have to come yourself, Your Grace," she said quietly. "You did not even have to write. A man in your position." "A man in my position," he said, "owes a debt to the Reverend Hartley that I have never had the opportunity to repay." "A debt? I do not understand." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, "When I was 17, your father found me reading in the Marrowfield churchyard during a service I was meant to be attending. I had been—" he paused as though selecting the word carefully. "Difficult. My own father had recently died, and I had taken to disappearing for hours at a time, and no one seemed to know quite what to do with me. Your father did not scold me. He sat down beside me on the grass in his vestments and asked what I was reading. We talked for 2 hours. He never told anyone where I had been. I have not forgotten it." Winifred stared at him. I do not remember this." "You were 12, I believe. You would not have been at the service." A faint, almost imperceptible curve touched the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "I remember you, however. You used to sit on the garden wall and watch the road for the post-coach, as though you expected something extraordinary to arrive on it any day." The memory rose up in her, unbidden and vivid. The warm stone of the wall beneath her, the dust of the lane, the particular boredom of a country childhood that made even the arrival of the post seem like an event. And, yes, now that he said it, she did remember a tall, dark-haired young man who sometimes walked the lane near the vicarage, who had once, memorably, helped her retrieve a kitten from beneath a hedge, without seeming to mind in the least that he had ruined his coat doing it. "That was you?" she said, before she could stop herself. "I am gratified," he said dryly, "that the kitten, at least, made an impression." It was such an unexpected thing to say, so dry, so nearly amused, that Winifred laughed before she could help it, a small surprised sound that seemed to startle them both. "Forgive me," she said again, pressing her fingers briefly to her lips. "I have not laughed in... I cannot recall how long." "Then I am glad to have been of service," he said. "In 2 capacities now, separated by some 15 years. He stayed longer than he had intended, she suspected. What had begun as the delivery of a small leather case became somehow nearly an hour of conversation about Marrowfield, about her father, about the years she had spent since leaving it. He asked careful questions and listened to her answers with a stillness that she found, after the brittle social performances of London drawing-rooms, almost startling. No one had looked at her like that in years, as though what she said actually mattered, as though he were not simply waiting for his turn to speak. He told her little of himself, in turn, that he had spent much of the past 7 years abroad, in the Mediterranean and later in India, managing interests his late brother had left in considerable disarray, that he had returned to England only the previous month, to a townhouse he had not properly inhabited since boyhood, and an estate that required, by his own dry estimation, rather more attention than I am inclined to give it, and rather less than it currently receives. He did not mention her wedding. He did not mention the 7 years between then and now, beyond the barest outline of where he had been. And Winifred, for her part, found herself unwilling to ask the question that hovered, unspoken, at the edges of the conversation. "Why did you come to the funeral?" When he finally rose to take his leave, he paused at the door. "Miss Hartley, I wonder if I might ask something of you, and you must feel entirely at liberty to refuse." "Of course, Your Grace." "My sister, Lady Cassandra, is to host a small dinner next week. Nothing grand. A handful of families, mostly people known to her rather than to fashionable society at large. She has asked me to bring acquaintances who might enliven the company, as she put it, rather more than the usual gathering of my mother's friends discussing the price of coal." A faint, dry note had entered his voice again. "I should be glad if you would consider attending. I am aware that your mourning period only recently concluded, and that you may not yet feel inclined toward society. But Cassandra's gatherings are quiet and kindly meant, and I think—" He paused. "I think it might do you some good to be somewhere you are not required to manage anyone's expectations of you." Winifred hesitated. Every instinct, honed by Constance Ashby's quiet cruelties, told her that accepting such an invitation from this man of all men would invite exactly the sort of scrutiny she had spent the last weeks trying to avoid. A young widow, barely out of her mourning blacks, accepting a dinner invitation from a duke who had attended her husband's funeral. But she thought, too, of the small leather case now sitting on her writing desk, and the warmth of being listened to, and the strange, dizzying realization that somewhere in the back of her memory a boy with ruined sleeves and a kitten under one arm had been real, and had been kind, and had apparently remembered her for 15 years. "I should like that very much, Your Grace," she said. "Thank you." Something in his expression eased, just slightly, just for a moment, like a held breath finally released. "Then I shall send the carriage for you Thursday evening. Good day, Miss Hartley." He bowed again and was gone, and Winifred stood for a long moment in her small drawing-room, holding her father's letters, feeling for the first time in months something that was not quite grief and not quite loneliness, but some third thing she did not yet have a name for. Now, before we go any further, I think it is worth understanding why Winifred's hesitation was not mere timidity, because the rules governing a widow's conduct in this period were considerably stricter than many people realize. A widow in Winifred's position was expected to observe a period of deep mourning, typically lasting a full year, during which she would wear unrelieved black, avoid all but the most necessary social engagements, and decline invitations to anything resembling entertainment. This was followed by second mourning, often another 6 months to a year, during which grey, lavender or muted purples might be introduced, and a gradual, careful return to limited society might begin. For Winifred, barely 3 weeks past the funeral, even attending a quiet family dinner carried real risk. Society's eyes were sharp, and a widow seen too soon in company, particularly in the company of an unmarried duke, might find herself the subject of precisely the kind of speculation that could permanently damage what little reputation she had left. A man of Hawthorne's rank might weather such gossip without consequence. A woman in Winifred's position would not. When Winifred accepted that invitation, she was not simply agreeing to dinner. She was taking the first deliberate risk of her adult life, and she knew it. Thursday arrived grey and blustery, with the particular damp chill of late October that seeped through even the heaviest cloak. Winifred dressed with more care than she had allowed herself in months, not the unrelieved black of deep mourning, which would have been a glaring statement at a dinner she was attending only weeks after the funeral, but the deep grey violet that marked the careful, ambiguous territory of a widow beginning, just barely, to step back into the world. Margaret had helped her dress, chattering nervously the entire time about what such an invitation might mean, until Winifred had finally asked her, with more sharpness than she intended, to please simply hand her the hairpins. The Hawthorne townhouse in Grosvenor Square was, Winifred discovered, considerably less imposing than she had braced herself for. Or perhaps it was simply that Lady Cassandra Hawthorne, a warm, sharp-eyed woman some 10 years older than her brother, had a gift for making even a vast townhouse feel, somehow, like a parlour. "So you're Winifred Hartley," Cassandra said, taking both of Winifred's hands the moment she entered, with a directness that startled her. Cedric has spoken of you exactly twice, which for my brother is the equivalent of a sonnet. Come, sit by me. I want to hear everything about Marrowfield because he has told me almost nothing, which I find enormously suspicious. The dinner was, as promised, small. Perhaps a dozen people, mostly older couples known to Cassandra through charitable committees and church circles, with none of the brittle social calculation Winifred had braced for. She found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply talking about books, about her father's old parish, about a ridiculous incident involving Cassandra's spaniel and a visiting bishop's wig, which had Winifred laughing so hard she had to set down her wine glass. And throughout it all, she was aware, acutely, constantly aware, of Cedric, seated across the table, who spoke little but watched a great deal, and whose dark eyes found hers again and again across the candlelight, with a quiet steadiness that she felt in her chest like the low note of a cello. It was after dinner, when the company had drifted into the drawing-room, and Cassandra had become absorbed in an argument about whist with an elderly admiral, that Winifred found herself, quite by accident, alone with Cedric, near the tall windows overlooking the dark square. "Your sister is delightful," she said. "I had not expected—" "Forgive me, that sounds unkind." "You had not expected a duke's household to feel like a home," he said. "No, most people don't. Cassandra has spent considerable effort ensuring it does, in spite of everything else about it." He glanced toward the window, toward the rain beginning to streak the glass. "I am glad you came, Miss Hartley. As am I." And she found, to her own surprise, that she meant it entirely. "May I ask you something?" His voice had dropped slightly, not quite a whisper, but pitched for her alone amid the genial chaos of the drawing-room behind them. "And you may tell me it is none of my concern, and I shall not raise it again." "Of course. Were you happy?" He was not looking at her now, but at the rain. "In your marriage. I do not ask to cause you pain. I ask because—" He stopped, started again. "I have wondered for a long time whether you were happy. It has mattered to me more than I can easily explain." Winifred was quiet for a long moment. "The honest answer, no, not happy, but not unhappy either, simply absent from my own life for 3 years, felt too raw, too strange to say aloud to anyone, let alone to a man she had only properly spoken to twice. He was not unkind to me," she said finally, "but I do not think he ever truly saw me. I was—" she searched for the word. "An arrangement. A comfortable one, for both of us, I think. But an arrangement." Cedric's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just for a moment, a flicker of something, controlled and contained, that vanished almost before she registered it. "I am sorry," he said quietly, "for the years you spent as an arrangement." "You need not be sorry, Your Grace. It was hardly your doing." "No," he agreed. And then so quietly she almost did not hear it over the rain. "But I have thought, more than once these past 7 years, of what I might have done differently had I been braver at 18. Before Winifred could ask what he meant, before she could even fully absorb the words or the strange ache that bloomed beneath her ribs at them, Cassandra's voice rang out from across the room, summoning her brother to settle a dispute about the rules of whist, and the moment dissolved as quickly as it had formed. But Winifred carried it home with her in the carriage, turning the words over and over. What I might have done differently had I been braver at 18. She did not sleep that night, not from grief this time, from something else entirely, something she had not felt in so long that it took her hours to identify it for what it was. Hope. I should pause here, because I know some of you may already be asking the question that occurred to me. Why would the Duke of Hawthorne, a man of such wealth and consequence, risk his own reputation by paying such open attention to a young widow only weeks out of mourning? Surely a man of his station had no shortage of more suitable matches, women of impeccable lineage and substantial fortune. Women's society would have applauded him for choosing. And that, I think, is precisely the point. He did not want any of them. He wanted a woman he had watched grow from a child on a garden wall into someone who had spent her entire adult life being told in ways both loud and quiet that she did not matter very much. And he was about to make it very clear to everyone exactly how wrong they had all been. The invitations did not stop after Cassandra's dinner. Within a fortnight, Winifred found herself receiving cards she had never expected to see. Not many, but enough to notice, and enough for others to notice as well. A small concert, an afternoon call from Cassandra herself, who arrived unannounced with a basket of hothouse oranges and stayed for 2 hours, talking with the easy warmth of an old friend. And, perhaps most remarkably, an invitation to a musical evening hosted by Lady Trent, a woman whose drawing room Winifred had never once, in 3 years of marriage, been admitted to. "You do understand what is happening," Margaret said one afternoon, settling into Winifred's drawing room with the air of a woman bearing important news. "People are talking, Winnie." "People are always talking, Margaret. Not like this. Mrs. Pemberton asked me directly, whether it was true the Duke of Hawthorne had called upon you 3 times in a fortnight. I did not know what to say." "You might have said it was true, since it is." Margaret stared at her. "Winnie, he is a duke. You are a widow of 6 weeks, with £60 a year and no family to speak of. Surely you cannot imagine that a man like that—" "I imagine nothing, Margaret." Winifred kept her voice level, though something in her chest had gone tight and defensive. "He has been kind to me. That is all." But it was not, of course, all. And Winifred knew it even as she said it, even as she told herself the same thing, over and over, in the privacy of her own thoughts. "He has been kind to me. That is all." It became something of an incantation, a small spell she repeated to keep herself from hoping for something that could not possibly come true. Because what, after all, could possibly come of it? A duke did not marry a wool merchant's widow. Society would never permit it, his family would never countenance it, and Winifred herself had no illusions about what such a match would cost him. And yet, at Lady Trent's musical evening 3 days later, Winifred discovered exactly how visible she had become. The evening began pleasantly enough, a young soprano performing several Italian arias, polite applause, the genteel rustle of fans and conversation. Winifred sat near the back, as she had grown accustomed to doing, content to be unremarkable. But during the interval, as she moved toward the refreshment table, she found her path blocked, deliberately, she was quite certain, by a tall, fair-haired man she recognized, with a sinking feeling, as Mr. Aldous Fenwick, a gentleman of considerable fortune and considerably less subtlety, whom she vaguely recalled from the edges of Josiah's social circle. "Lady Ashby," Fenwick said, with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Or is it Hartley now? I confess I find the etiquette of these things rather confusing." "Mr. Fenwick." Winifred inclined her head, hoping he would take the hint and move along. He did not. "I had heard," he continued, lowering his voice with the air of a man sharing a delicious secret, "that you have been keeping rather elevated company of late. The Duke of Hawthorne, no less. One does wonder what a man of his position finds so very compelling about a widow of your particular circumstances." "I am not aware that my circumstances are any concern of yours, Mr. Fenwick." "Oh, come now, my lady. I mean no offence, merely an observation. A young widow, recently bereaved, with so little to recommend her beyond—" His gaze travelled over her, slow and assessing, in a way that made Winifred's skin crawl. "Well, beyond the obvious. One can hardly blame a man for taking an interest, though I confess I had rather hoped to take an interest myself before his Grace arrived to spoil my prospects." "Mr. Fenwick, I do hope," he said, leaning closer, his voice dropping further still, "that you understand precisely what sort of interest a man like Hawthorne is likely to have in a woman of your situation. Dukes do not marry wool merchants' widows, my dear. Whatever attentions he pays you now, you would do well to remember that, when the novelty wears off, you will find yourself with rather less to show for it than you might hope. I, at least, would offer you the dignity of an honest arrangement." Winifred felt the blood drain from her face. The implication was unmistakable, and delivered, she realized with mounting horror, just loudly enough that the two women standing nearest had clearly heard every word and were now watching her with the particular hungry interest of people anticipating a scene. "You will excuse me, Mr. Fenwick," she managed, her voice shaking despite every effort to steady it, and turned to leave directly into the path of Cedric, who had appeared, silent and sudden, at her shoulder. She had no idea how long he had been standing there, but from the look on his face, the stillness of it, the particular cold quality that had settled over his features like ice forming on a window pane, she understood with absolute certainty that he had heard every word Fenwick said. "Mr. Fenwick." Cedric's voice was perfectly pleasant, perfectly calm, and underneath it Winifred could hear something that made the hair on her arms rise. "I do not believe we have been introduced." "Your Grace." Fenwick's bow was hasty and considerably less steady than his earlier swagger had been. I had not realized." "No," Cedric agreed. "I rather think you had not." He had not raised his voice at all, and yet Winifred saw three separate conversations near them falter and die. "Mrs. Ashby is known to my family. She is, in fact, the daughter of a man my own family held in the highest regard, and she is under my protection in any matter that concerns her standing in society. I wonder, Mr. Fenwick, whether you might wish to reconsider the interest you have just described, given that consideration." "Your Grace, I assure you, I meant nothing." "I am quite certain you did not mean for me to hear it," Cedric said, and the dryness of it was somehow more frightening than any raised voice could have been. "But you should know that I have an excellent memory, Mr. Fenwick, and a considerable interest in matters of trade and shipping insurance, two areas in which, I understand, your own fortunes are rather more precariously balanced than is generally known. I should hate for that information to become widely discussed, as you say. People do so love to talk." Fenwick went white. "I trust," Cedric continued, "that we shall not have occasion to speak again on this matter or any other." No, Your Grace, of course not. Good evening." And Fenwick was gone, practically fleeing into the crowd, leaving behind a silence that Winifred could feel pressing against her skin like a physical thing. "Are you quite well?" Cedric's voice had changed entirely, gentle now, urgent, his hand hovering near her elbow without quite touching her, as though he were not certain whether the contact would be welcome. Yes. Thank you. I am sorry. I did not mean to cause—" "You caused nothing," he said, low and fierce. "He is the one who will answer for what he said, not you. Come, will you walk with me? The terrace doors are open. I think you could use some air, and I confess I find I require it as well." The terrace was cold and nearly deserted, lit only by the spill of candlelight from the windows behind them and the thin silver edge of a half-moon. Winifred drew her shawl tighter, grateful for the bite of the air after the close, humiliating warmth of the drawing-room. "I should not have laughed at his comments earlier in the evening," Cedric said after a long moment. "He has clearly believed himself entitled to certain conclusions, and I have done nothing to discourage them beyond—" He stopped. "I have been thoughtless. I am sorry." "You have done nothing wrong, Your Grace." "I have done a great many things wrong," he said, and there was something raw in his voice now, something she had not heard from him before. "I should have spoken to you weeks ago. Properly, honestly, instead of these careful visits and dinners and concerts. as though I were courting you by half measures and hoping you would not notice. You deserve better than half measures, Winifred. You have spent your whole life receiving half measures from everyone around you, and I will not be one more person who does that to you." Winifred's breath caught. He had used her given name, the first time he had done so since they were children, and the sound of it in his voice, low and unsteady, undid something in her chest that she had spent years carefully holding together. "Cedric," she said, and watched his eyes close briefly at the sound of his own name, as though it were something he had wanted to hear for a very long time. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," he said, turning to face her fully now, "that I have loved you since I was 17 years old and you were 12, sitting on a garden wall, scolding me for ruining my coat over a kitten that did not even like you. I am saying that I went away to India because I could not bear to watch you marry another man, and that I came back the moment I learned you were free, and that I have spent the last 2 months trying to be patient and careful and correct, and I find that I am no longer capable of any of those things." "Cedric." "I am not asking you for anything tonight," he said quickly, as though he feared she might flee if he did not say it. "I know what tonight has cost you. What that man said, what people will whisper tomorrow. I would never add to that. But I needed you to know, I needed you to understand that whatever they say about why I have sought your company, the truth is far simpler than any of it. I love you. I have loved you for 15 years, and I do not intend to spend another single day pretending otherwise." The moon slipped behind a cloud, and in the sudden, near darkness, Winifred became aware of how close they were standing, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him against the cold night air, close enough to see the rapid rise and fall of his breath, close enough that when he lifted one hand, slowly, achingly slowly, to brush a strand of hair from her face, she did not step back. "May I—" he started, his voice barely audible. The terrace doors banged open behind them, spilling light and laughter, and the shrill voice of Lady Trent, calling for everyone to come back inside for the second half of the programme, and the moment shattered as completely as if it had been struck with a hammer. Cedric's hand dropped. Winifred stepped back, her heart pounding, her face burning in the darkness where, thankfully, no one could see it. "We should go in," she said, breathless, and did not look at him again until they had rejoined the crowd, though she was aware every moment for the rest of the evening of exactly where he was standing, and exactly how carefully he was not looking at her, which was somehow more intimate than if he had stared. The story Mr. Fenwick had not been able to spread himself found its way into circulation regardless, not through him, but through the 2 women who had overheard his comments and who proved considerably less discreet. By the following afternoon, Winifred's name was attached to a flurry of speculation that ranged from the merely unkind to the genuinely vicious. And it was into this atmosphere that Constance Ashby arrived at Winifred's door, unannounced, her face set in the particular rigid lines of a woman who had heard something she considered deeply improper. "I will not stay long," Constance said, refusing the offer of a chair, standing instead in the centre of Winifred's small drawing-room like a judge delivering a verdict. "I have come only to say this. Whatever foolishness you have allowed yourself to become entangled in, you would do well to extract yourself from it immediately. The Duke of Hawthorne making a spectacle of you at Lady Trent's musical evening in front of half of London is precisely the sort of attention that will see you cast out of decent society altogether. My son's name, Ashby's name, is attached to yours whether you like it or not, and I will not have it dragged through gossip columns because you have allowed a duke to flatter you into believing you are something you are not." "And what precisely am I not, Mrs. Ashby?" "You are a wool merchant's widow," Constance said, with the flat certainty of a woman who believed she was stating an immutable law of nature. You will always be a wool merchant's widow. Dukes do not marry such women, Winifred. They amuse themselves with them for a season, and then they marry suitable women from suitable families, and the wool merchant's widows are left to manage the consequences alone. I have seen it happen. I have watched it happen to women considerably better placed than you. I am telling you this for your own protection, whatever you may think of my motives. And if I told you, Winifred said, her voice steadier than she felt, that His Grace's intentions toward me are entirely honourable. Constance laughed, a short, humourless sound. Then I would tell you that you are a fool, and that you will learn, as every woman in your position eventually learns, precisely how little honour matters when it comes to the difference between a duke and a duchess. Good day, Winifred. I shall not call again until you have come to your senses. She left without another word, and Winifred stood, alone in her drawing room, shaking, not with grief this time, but with something closer to fury, and beneath the fury a small cold seed of doubt that she could not quite dislodge no matter how hard she tried. Dukes do not marry wool merchants' widows. She knew it was true. She had always known it was true, and yet standing on that dark terrace the night before, with Cedric's hand against her face and his voice breaking on her name, she had allowed herself for the first time in years to believe that the rules that governed everyone else's lives might somehow not apply to her own. Now it is worth understanding why Constance Ashby's warning carried the weight that it did. Because in 1850s England, the gap between a duke and a tradesman's widow was not simply a matter of snobbery. It was a matter of law, of inheritance, of the entire architecture by which aristocratic families preserved their wealth and status across generations. A duke's marriage was never considered solely his own affair. It affected the standing of his entire family, the prospects of his sisters and cousins, the alliances his estate could draw upon, and, crucially, the inheritance of his title and lands. Marrying significantly beneath one's station was not merely frowned upon. It could, in some families, prompt formal objections. From relatives, social ostracism that extended to the entire family, and in extreme cases, attempts to have a marriage annulled or a man declared unfit to manage his own estate. For a duke to marry the widow of a tradesman, a woman with no land, no significant fortune, and no family connections of consequence, would have been considered by the standards of the time a scandal of the first order. It is precisely this weight of expectation that Winifred was up against. And it is precisely this weight that Cedric Hawthorne was about to defy, completely and in the most public way imaginable. She did not see him for nearly a week. It was the longest week of Winifred's life since Josiah's death, longer in some ways, because grief had at least been familiar. A known country with known landmarks. This was something else, the slow, grinding anxiety of not knowing, of replaying that moment on the terrace over and over, wondering whether she had imagined the things he said, whether the gossip and Constance's warning and the sheer crushing weight of what dukes do not do had finally caught up with him too, and made him reconsider. No card came, no carriage appeared on her street. Margaret, who had initially been scandalized, now seemed almost more anxious than Winifred herself, hovering with unhelpful questions about whether perhaps Winifred ought to write to him, or whether that would be improper, or whether— "Margaret," Winifred said finally, on the 5th day, with a calm she did not feel, "I am going to take a walk, alone. Please do not follow me." She walked for over an hour, through streets grown unfamiliar with cold and early dusk, until she found herself, almost without realizing it, near the edge of Hyde Park, where the last walkers were hurrying home before full dark. She had nearly turned back. The light was fading fast, and a woman alone in the park as evening fell was not safe, whatever her own troubles, when she heard, behind her, the sound of hurried footsteps, and a voice she did not recognize. "Mrs. Ashby," "A moment, if you please." She turned. A man she had never seen before stood a few feet away, well dressed, but with something unsettling in his expression, something that made the hair on the back of her neck rise even before he took a step closer. "I'm afraid you've mistaken me for someone else," she said, already backing away, her heart beginning to pound. "No mistake at all." He smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. "Mr. Fenwick sends his compliments, my lady. He thought you might benefit from a reminder of your proper place, seeing as his grace appears to have abandoned you to it." He moved faster than she expected, closing the distance between them, his hand closing hard around her wrist. "Come along now. No need to make a fuss. Let go of me!" Winifred wrenched backward, but his grip only tightened, twisting her arm in a way that sent a bolt of pain up to her shoulder. She opened her mouth to scream, and a voice, low and absolutely lethal, cut through the dusk like a blade. "Take your hand off her, now!" The man's grip loosened in shock, and Winifred wrenched free, stumbling backward as Cedric came out of the gathering darkness, like something summoned rather than arrived. And for one terrible, breathless moment, Winifred thought he might actually kill the man standing in front of her. His face was a mask of absolute, controlled fury, the kind of fury that did not need to shout to be terrifying. "Your Grace, I meant no harm. I was only—" "You were following Mrs. Ashby," Cedric said, advancing, "having been sent, I have no doubt, by a man whose financial affairs I have already begun examining with considerable interest. Give Mr. Fenwick a message from me. Tell him that if he or anyone acting on his behalf comes within 100 yards of Mrs. Ashby again, I will not trouble myself with subtlety the next time. Do you understand me?" The man fled into the dusk without another word, and then Cedric was turning to her, his hands gentle now where they had been clenched into fists only seconds before, cradling her injured wrist with a tenderness that made her eyes sting. "Winifred, are you hurt? Tell me you are not hurt." "I am well, truly. He frightened me more than he hurt me." But her voice was shaking, and so, she realized, were her hands. And when Cedric drew her against him, carefully, as though she might break, she did not resist at all. She simply stood there, in the cold and the near dark, and let herself be held for the first time in years by someone who looked at her as though she mattered. "I should not have stayed away," he said into her hair, his voice rough. "I thought, after the terrace, after everything that was said about us, I thought I should give you time, give you room to decide whether you wanted any of this, whether the cost of it was worth—" He pulled back enough to look at her, his expression stricken. "I have been a coward, again. I told myself it was for your sake, and perhaps some part of it was, but the truth is I was afraid that if I pressed, you would tell me what Constance Ashby has no doubt already told you, that this is impossible, that I am asking you to throw yourself onto a fire for my sake." "Cedric." Winifred reached up, her uninjured hand cupping his jaw, feeling him go still beneath her touch. "I do not care what Constance Ashby thinks is impossible. I have spent my entire life being told what is and is not possible for a woman like me, and I find—" her voice caught— "I find I am tired of believing them." Something in his face broke open then, relief and hope, and something fiercer than either. And this time, when he lowered his head toward hers, there was no interruption, no terrace door banging open, no Lady Trent calling them back to propriety. There was only the cold evening air and the last grey light fading from the sky, and his mouth against hers, gentle at first, and then not gentle at all, and Winifred's hands fisting in the lapels of his coat as though she could anchor herself to him against the entire weight of everything society would say about this moment. When they finally drew apart, breathless, foreheads pressed together, Cedric's hands cradling her face as though she were something infinitely precious, he said, very quietly, Marry me, Winifred, not because of tonight, not because of anything Fenwick has done, though God knows I intend to see him ruined for it regardless. Marry me because I have loved you for 15 years, and I cannot bear another 15 without you. Cedric. Winifred laughed, a small, disbelieving, joyful sound, even with tears on her face. It has been 6 weeks since Josiah died. Society will say, I know what society will say, I do not care. His thumb traced gently along her cheekbone, wiping away a tear she had not realized had fallen. Let them say it. Let them say whatever they like. I am done living my life according to what other people believe a duke ought to do. I want you. I have only ever wanted you. Say yes. And Winifred, standing in the deepening dark of Hyde Park, her wrist aching and her heart pounding, and every rule she had ever been taught screaming at her to be sensible, to be careful, to remember her place, said yes. The engagement was announced within the week. Cedric, Winifred discovered, was not a man inclined toward half measures once he had decided against them, and the notice appeared in the papers with a swiftness that left no room for anyone to claim it had been a misunderstanding or a rumour, or anything other than precisely what it was. The reaction was everything Constance Ashby had promised, and worse. Cassandra, of course, was overjoyed. She arrived at Winifred's door the morning the notice appeared with a bottle of champagne, 3 different bonnets for inspiration, and the cheerful announcement that she had already begun making a list of everyone who would be unbearable about it, and everyone who would, eventually, come around. But beyond the Hawthorne household, the response was considerably colder. Society, it transpired, did not take kindly to a duke marrying a tradesman's widow only 6 weeks after that widow's first husband had been buried, and the fact that the duke in question was wealthy enough and powerful enough to weather any scandal himself did nothing to soften the venom directed at Winifred. Invitations that had only recently begun to arrive now stopped entirely. Old acquaintances who had once condescended to acknowledge her now crossed the street rather than meet her eye. And the whispers. The whispers were everywhere, vicious and creative in equal measure, that she had trapped him somehow with feminine wiles unbecoming a respectable widow, that she had been his mistress for years, even during her marriage to Josiah, that the haste of the engagement could only be explained by some scandal too shocking to name aloud. I do not understand, Winifred said one evening, sitting with Cedric in Cassandra's drawing-room, a newspaper containing a particularly cruel piece of gossip column speculation lying unread on the table between them. I knew it would be difficult, but I had not understood how much it would, how much they would enjoy it. The cruelty of it, as though my happiness is something that personally offends them. It does offend them, Cedric said grimly. That is precisely the trouble. You have done the one thing society cannot forgive. You have proven that the rules they live by are not, in fact, immutable laws of nature, but simply choices made by people that could have been made differently. And people who have spent their entire lives believing those rules protected them do not enjoy discovering that they were never as solid as they seemed. But the cruelty of the whispers was not the only weight Winifred carried in those weeks, and it was a smaller, quieter moment, almost a week later, that did the real damage. Cassandra had taken to bringing Winifred the worst of the gossip columns herself, on the theory, not entirely wrong, that hearing it from a friend with commentary was less painful than discovering it alone. But one evening Cassandra arrived, looking troubled in a way Winifred had not seen before, and handed over a column with visible reluctance. It was not this time an attack on Winifred directly. It was a piece concerning the Hawthorne dukedom itself, a long speculative article about the estate's finances, suggesting that Cedric's years abroad had left the dukedom's affairs in worse condition than was generally known, and that his sudden, hasty marriage to a woman of no fortune immediately upon his return might be rather more convenient for him than anyone had considered. The implication, delicately but unmistakably made, was that perhaps Winifred was not the fortunate party in this match at all, that perhaps a duke whose finances required quiet repair had simply found in a grateful and friendless widow someone unlikely to ask difficult questions about where his money had gone or why. Winifred read it twice in Cassandra's drawing room and felt something cold settle into her stomach. It was not that she believed it, not exactly, but it called up with horrible precision every fear she had spent weeks trying not to examine too closely, that she did not actually know this man, not really, not in the way one ought to know someone before marrying them. She knew the boy who had saved a kitten. She knew the man who wrote letters he never sent. But she did not know the Duke, his finances, his obligations, the 7 years of his life she had no part of, and the article's insinuation, however unfounded, found the one place in her heart still soft enough to bruise. What if this, too, is an arrangement, and you are simply too grateful to notice? She said nothing of it to Cedric that evening. She told herself she was simply tired. But over the following days, something shifted, subtly at first, and then less subtly. Winifred found herself, without quite deciding to, asking careful questions about the estate, about his time in India, about the interests his brother had left in disarray. Questions that seemed innocuous enough on their surface, but which Cedric, exhausted, harried by his own steward over precisely the kind of financial matters the article had referenced, and entirely unaware of what had prompted them, answered with increasing brevity, increasingly preoccupied, increasingly absent, in the way of a man whose attention was genuinely elsewhere. To Winifred, raw from years of being an afterthought in her own marriage, his distraction read as something else entirely. Confirmation. He does not wish to discuss it. There is something he is not telling me. The article's poison, once swallowed, did not need much encouragement to spread. The argument, when it came, was almost absurdly small in its origin. A missed dinner, on an evening Cedric had been delayed for hours by an emergency meeting with his solicitors regarding, in fact, precisely the financial matters the gossip column had so unhelpfully publicized. Though he did not explain this, arriving home late, drained and short-tempered, to find Winifred waiting in the drawing-room with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not hurt, exactly. Closed. "You are angry," he said, too tired to phrase it gently. "I am not angry." Her voice was careful, controlled. The voice, Cedric realized with a jolt, of the woman he had first met, the one who had spent years learning not to want things too visibly. "I simply find myself wondering, Cedric, whether there is a great deal about your affairs that you do not intend to share with me. The estate, India, whatever it is that has kept you from this house at every hour for the past week. I am not asking out of suspicion." Her hands twisted together in her lap. "I am asking because I have spent 3 years married to a man who simply did not think his affairs were any of my concern, and I find I will not do that again, even for you. Winifred, the estate's finances are tedious beyond description, and I had not thought—" "You had not thought to tell me," she said, and there it was. The wound beneath the words, raw and exposed. "That is rather the point, Cedric. You did not think of it at all." "That is not the same as concealing something from you." "Is it not?" Her voice cracked just slightly. "Forgive me. I am tired, and I think I should go home tonight rather than stay." "Winifred, please, Cedric." And something in her face. Some old, exhausted defensiveness he recognized with a sinking heart as the same expression she had worn the day he first called upon her, before she had let herself believe any of this was real, made him step back rather than press further, though every instinct in him screamed against it. "Of course," he said quietly, "I will have the carriage brought round." She did not return for 4 days. It was not, either of them would later admit, much of a quarrel by the standards of quarrels, no shouted accusations, no broken engagements, nothing so dramatic as the gossip columns might have hoped for had they known. But it was, in its quiet way, the first real test of whether what existed between them could survive an ordinary human misunderstanding, the kind that has nothing to do with dukes or scandal or 7 years of unsent letters, and everything to do with two people who had spent so long being unseen that they had not yet learned how to be seen fully by each other, without flinching. In the Bloomsbury house, Winifred sat for long hours in the same small drawing-room where Cedric had first returned her father's letters, the room that had once felt like the whole of her diminished world, and now felt, after weeks, in Cassandra's bright, warm townhouse, unbearably small and unbearably quiet. She found herself returning again and again to her father's old letters, rereading the one addressed to her, "My dearest Winifred," searching it for some kind of certainty she could not name. Margaret came twice, anxious and hovering, and was sent away both times with assurances that nothing was wrong, assurances Margaret did not believe for a moment and was wise enough not to challenge. On the second night, Winifred did not sleep at all. She sat by the cold grate. She had not asked Hodge to light a fire, telling herself she did not feel the chill, though she sat wrapped in every shawl she owned, and found herself doing something she had not done since she was a girl. She took out paper and ink and began, haltingly, to write. "Cedric, I do not know how to say what I mean to say, so I am writing it instead, which I suppose is rather fitting, given everything. I am not angry about the estate, or India, or any of it. I think I knew that even as I said it. What I am afraid of—" She stopped, crossed it out, began again. By dawn, the floor beside her chair was littered with half-finished attempts, none of which she sent. In Grosvenor Square, Cedric fared little better. He had retreated in the days following Winifred's departure to his study, the same room where, weeks earlier, he had shown her the cabinet of unsent letters, and found himself unable to settle to anything at all. Cassandra found him there on the third evening, surrounded by estate ledgers. He was visibly not reading, staring instead at the cabinet, which stood open and empty now, its contents given away, its purpose served. "You look terrible," Cassandra said, with the bluntness only an older sister could deploy. "Have you eaten anything today?" "I do not require a catalogue of my failings, Cassandra. I am aware of them." "Are you?" She sat down across from him, unbidden, "because from where I am sitting it looks rather as though my brother, who spent 7 years writing letters to a woman he loved because he was too afraid to send them, has now spent 4 days not writing a letter to that same woman because he is afraid of something else entirely. I wonder what that might be." Cedric did not answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice was rough in a way Cassandra had rarely heard from him. "What if I have already done it again? What if, in trying so hard not to repeat the mistakes of the last 7 years, I have simply made new ones, the same ones, in a different shape? She has spent her whole life with people who did not think her feelings were worth considering, and in one tired, thoughtless evening, I made her feel exactly that. After everything, after the letters, after everything I said to her in the park." "Cedric," Cassandra's voice softened, "do you know what I think the difference is between you and every other man who has ever disappointed that woman?" "What?" "They never came back to apologize. You are sitting here 4 days later, still thinking about it, still caring whether you hurt her, still trying to understand why. That is not the same as not caring at all, little brother. That is simply what it looks like when two people who have spent years being careful with everyone else finally have to learn how to be careless, messily, imperfectly careless with each other. It will not be the last time, but it does not have to be the thing that ends it either. Not unless you let it be. On the fourth morning, a letter arrived at the Bloomsbury house. Not delivered by Cedric's own hand this time, but by ordinary post, which Winifred noted with a small, unexpected ache, was somehow more affecting than if he had come himself. It would have been so easy, after everything, to simply appear at her door. Instead, he had done the harder thing. He had written. Winifred, I am not going to attempt to explain away what happened, because I do not think explanations are what either of us needs right now. I was thoughtless. You were right to be hurt by it, and right to tell me so, and I am sorry, not for the estate's tedious finances, which truly are tedious beyond bearing, but for the 4 days you have spent wondering whether I meant what I said to you in that park, when the truth is that I have never meant anything more in my life, and I am only now beginning to understand how badly I have just demonstrated that. I do not expect you to come back today or tomorrow if you are not ready, but I wanted you to know that I am not waiting for you to come back because I expect an apology, or because I believe time will simply smooth this over on its own. I am waiting because I love you, and because I would rather wait as long as it takes than rush you toward forgiving something before you are ready to. For what it is worth, and I suspect it is worth a great deal less than I would like, I spent the last 4 days in the study, where the empty cabinet still stands open, because I could not bring myself to close it. It felt somehow like giving up on something. I do not intend to give up on this, on us. Whatever this looks like, going forward, even if it looks like both of us being rather worse at this than either of us hoped. Yours, however imperfectly, C. Winifred read the letter sitting in the same chair where she had spent 2 sleepless nights in the same cold room, and found that her hands, for the first time in 4 days, were not shaking with anxiety but with something gentler, relief and recognition, and the dawning understanding that perhaps what she had been afraid of was never really about India or estates or unexplained absences at all. It was about whether 2 people who had each spent years being quietly diminished by the people closest to them could learn to be honest with each other in the moment, not just in grand declarations on dark terraces, but in small, ordinary, unglamorous evenings when one of them was late for dinner and the other was tired and frightened and did not yet know how to say so. She wrote back only 4 words on the back of his own letter and sent it by the same post within the hour. Come, I am ready. He arrived within 2 hours. She suspected he had been watching for the post himself, and when Hodge announced him, Winifred was already on her feet, already moving toward the door, and whatever words either of them had prepared dissolved entirely the moment she was in his arms. His face pressed into her hair, both of them holding on as though 4 days had been 4 years. I am sorry, he said into her hair, for all of it, for the dinner, and for not understanding sooner what that article had done, and for not asking what was truly wrong before I let my own tiredness make everything worse. I am sorry too, Winifred said, her voice muffled against his coat. I let an old fear speak louder than what I actually know to be true about you. I should have told you what the article said, instead of letting it fester into something neither of us could see clearly. Then let us make a rule, Cedric said, drawing back just enough to look at her, his thumb brushing away the last of her tears. Whatever it is, whatever frightens us, whatever old wound gets reopened, we say it, out loud, that same day if we can manage it. No more empty cabinets standing open for 4 days because neither of us can bear to close them. That, Winifred said with a small unsteady laugh, sounds like an excellent rule, Your Grace. Cedric, he corrected gently, and kissed her, softly this time, nothing like the urgency of the park, something quieter and steadier, a promise rather than a declaration. always, Cedric, even when I am tired and thoughtless and entirely undeserving of you." "Especially then," Winifred murmured against his mouth and felt him smile. The fortnight that followed was by any measure the happiest of Winifred's life. There was nothing dramatic in it, no grand gestures, no terraces, no declarations, only small things, breakfasts that stretched into the middle of the morning because neither of them wished to rise first, walks through the hawthorn gardens, Cedric pointing out which of the roses his grandmother had planted herself and which had been added since. An afternoon spent entirely in the library, Winifred reading aloud from a battered volume of poetry, while Cedric ostensibly reviewed estate papers, and in fact did no such thing at all, watching her instead with an expression so unguarded that she eventually set the book down simply to laugh at him for it. The gossip had not stopped. It never entirely did, but it had begun, slowly, to lose its sting. Cassandra had been right. Some of society's harshest voices had already begun to soften, sensing which way the wind was now blowing, and finding it suddenly rather more convenient to recall that they had always thought Winifred Hartley a perfectly respectable young woman. It was into this quiet, ordinary happiness that Constance Ashby arrived, like a draught through a closing door. It was during this same period, nearly 3 weeks before the wedding, which Cedric had insisted should take place as soon as possible, special license obtained, before either of us comes to our senses, as he put it, with a wry, tired smile, that Constance Ashby made her final move. She arrived not at Winifred's house this time, but at the Hawthorn townhouse itself, demanding an audience with the Duke, and Winifred, who happened to be present discussing wedding arrangements with Cassandra, found herself an unwilling witness to the entire confrontation. "Your Grace." Constance's curtsy was correct, but her face was set in lines of cold determination. "I have come to discuss a matter of some delicacy. I understand you intend to marry my late son's widow." "I do?" "Then there is something you ought to know, something which I believe may alter your assessment of the situation considerably." Constance's eyes flicked, briefly, to Winifred, with something almost triumphant in them. "My son's marriage to Winifred Hartley was not the simple arrangement she has perhaps led you to believe. There were debts, significant ones. Josiah's business affairs were in considerable disarray in the final years of his life, and the marriage was, in part, a means of resolving certain financial obligations to her father's estate, obligations which, I should add, were never properly settled. If word of this were to circulate, if it were understood that the woman you intend to marry comes to you not merely as a tradesman's widow, but as a woman whose marriage was itself a transaction undertaken to settle her own family's debts, I wonder how that might sit with a man of your standing, Your Grace. People do enjoy a scandal with financial irregularities at its heart far more than they enjoy mere matters of class." The silence that followed was absolute. Winifred felt the blood drain from her face, not because the accusation was true exactly, but because there was a kernel of something in it that she recognized. Her father had owed money in his final years to several creditors, debts that had quietly disappeared around the time of her marriage, and she had never fully understood why, had never thought to ask, had simply been grateful that her father's final months had not been clouded by financial worry on top of his failing health. "Is this true?" Cedric asked, not to Constance but to Winifred, his voice gentle, giving her the chance to answer before anyone else could. I did not know," Winifred said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father's debts. I knew there had been some difficulty near the end, but I never knew the particulars. I did not know my marriage had anything to do with—" She stopped, mortified, the implication settling over her like cold water. "You are saying I was sold, that Josiah paid my father's debts, and in exchange—" "I am saying," Constance said, with the satisfied precision of a woman who had been saving this particular weapon for exactly the right moment, that the woman you intend to marry, Your Grace, was once herself the subject of precisely the kind of transaction your family will be horrified to discover is now repeating itself. Except this time, the transaction runs in the other direction. A woman whose first marriage was, in effect, purchased, now marrying upward into a dukedom. I imagine the newspapers will find the symmetry of it quite irresistible. Mrs. Ashby. Cedric's voice had gone very quiet, the same quiet Winifred had heard in Hyde Park, the quiet that preceded something far more dangerous than shouting. I want to be entirely certain I understand you correctly. You have just confirmed in front of witnesses that your son's marriage to Winifred was arranged as a financial transaction to settle her father's debts. Debts that, I assume, your family was either owed directly or had some interest in seeing settled. Constance's confident expression flickered just slightly. I do not see what relevance— You will see it shortly, Cedric said. Because what you have just told me, Mrs. Ashby, is not a threat against my marriage. It is a confession of your own family's role in arranging what amounts to the sale of a 19-year-old girl to settle a debt, and the subsequent 3 years during which that girl was kept entirely ignorant of the circumstances of her own marriage, while your family, I have no doubt, continued to extract whatever benefit you could from the arrangement. Tell me, Mrs. Ashby, was the debt ever actually settled? Or did Josiah simply absorb the obligation himself while your family quietly avoided whatever consequences you might otherwise have faced? The colour drained from Constance's face. That is not— You misrepresent— I do not believe I do. Cedric's voice remained perfectly level, perfectly controlled, and somehow this made it far more frightening than fury would have been. I have, as it happens, spent considerable time over the past several weeks reviewing matters relating to the estate of the late Reverend Hartley, initially out of simple curiosity regarding an old family connection, but I find the information has proven rather more useful than I anticipated. I am aware, for instance, that the debts in question were originally owed to your family, Mrs. Ashby, a private loan made to Reverend Hartley some years before his death, which your son's marriage to his daughter conveniently absorbed and erased, with no formal record remaining anywhere that might suggest impropriety. I imagine that arrangement suited everyone involved, everyone, that is, except the 19-year-old girl who was never told any of it, and who spent 3 years believing herself fortunate to have made a respectable match. You cannot prove any of this, Constance said, but her voice had lost all its earlier confidence. I can, Cedric said simply, and I will. Mrs. Ashby, you came here today believing you held information that would damage Winifred's reputation badly enough to end our engagement. What you have actually done is hand me the means to expose your own family's conduct toward her. Conduct considerably more shameful than anything society could possibly hold against her. I wonder which story the papers will find more compelling. A tradesman's widow marrying a duke for love, or a respectable family arranging the sale of a child to settle a private debt, and then spending years treating that same child with contempt for the misfortune they themselves created. You would not dare. The scandal would touch your own family as well by association. I find, Cedric said, that I have grown remarkably indifferent to scandal, Mrs. Ashby. You, I suspect, have not. He moved to the door and opened it himself, a clear dismissal. I shall give you a choice. You may withdraw, quietly, from any further interference in Winifred's life. No further visits, no further comments to society, no further attempts to threaten or diminish her in any way. And this conversation need never be repeated to anyone. Or you may continue as you have begun, and I will ensure that every detail of how your family treated Winifred Hartley becomes a matter of considerable public interest. The choice, I think, is rather obvious, but it is yours to make. Constance Ashby left without another word, and without, Winifred noted, ever once looking at her. It was that evening, in the quiet aftermath of Constance's departure, that Winifred found herself unable to settle, the revelation of her own marriage's true nature sitting in her chest like a stone, reshaping years of memory she had never thought to question. She had wandered, restless, into the Hawthorne townhouse's library, where Cedric had retreated to deal with correspondence, and where she found him not at his desk, but standing before an open cabinet, one she had never seen opened before, with an expression on his face she had never seen. "Cedric, what is it?" He did not answer immediately. When he turned toward her, there was something almost stricken in his expression, not guilt exactly, but something close to it, the look of a man caught in the act of being discovered. "I had hoped," he said slowly, "that you would not need to see this. Not because I am ashamed of it, precisely, but because I was not certain how to explain it without it sounding—" He stopped. "Without it sounding rather more than I intended it to seem." He stepped aside from the cabinet, and Winifred moved closer and felt her breath leave her entirely. Inside were letters, dozens of them, perhaps more than 100, each addressed in Cedric's hand to Miss Winifred Hartley, and every single one of them sealed, unsent, some of the wax cracked with age, the paper yellowed at the edges. The earliest were dated from his first year in India, 7 years ago. The most recent was dated only a month before Josiah's death. "I wrote to you," Cedric said quietly, "every few months, for 7 years. I told myself each time that I would not send it, that it would be unfair to you, married to another man, to receive letters from someone who had no right to write them. But I could not stop myself from writing them either, so I kept them, all of them." He picked one up, the oldest, its seal long since cracked open by age rather than intent, and held it out to her, his hand not quite steady. "You do not have to read them. I would understand if you did not wish to, but I did not want there to be anything between us that you did not know about. Not any more." Winifred took the letter with trembling hands. The paper was soft with age, the ink faded but still legible, and she unfolded it slowly, almost reverently, and began to read. "My dear Miss Hartley, I am told you were married last month, and I find I cannot settle to anything today, though I have tried. I hope he is kind to you. I hope, more than I can say, that you are happy, though I confess the thought of your happiness with another man is one I find I cannot examine too closely, for my own sake. I think often of the garden wall, and the kitten, and the particular seriousness with which you informed me, at 12 years old, that I had ruined everything by saving its life at the cost of my second-best coat. I do not know why that memory has stayed with me so vividly, across everything that has happened since, my father's death, my brother's, the strange and distant life I find myself living now, half a world away from everything I once knew. But it has. You have stayed with me, Winifred, in ways I do not fully understand and have not tried very hard to explain to myself. I will not send this. I have no right to burden you with it. But I find I needed to write it, all the same, if only so that somewhere, in some drawer, there exists a record of the truth, that I have thought of you every single day since the day I left England, and that no distance and no time has changed it in the slightest. I hope you are happy. I hope it more than I have ever hoped for anything. C." Winifred could not speak. She read the letter again, and then a third time, and then she set it down with hands that shook and pressed both palms against her face, and wept. Not the careful, controlled tears of grief she had learned to manage in public, but something raw, something that came from somewhere much deeper, the accumulated weight of 7 years of loneliness suddenly given a shape and a name and proof, undeniable proof, that she had not been alone in it, after all. "Winifred," Cedric was beside her instantly, his arms around her, his voice rough with his own emotion. "I am sorry. I should not have shown you. I have upset you." "No." Winifred turned into him, her hands fisting in his coat, her face pressed against his chest. "No, Cedric, you do not understand. All those years, I thought I had simply imagined it. That night at the wall, that it had meant nothing to you, that I was a foolish girl who had built something out of nothing, and all this time—" Her voice broke entirely. "All this time you were writing to me, even when you knew you would never send it. You were writing to me the whole time." "Every time," he said into her hair, his own voice unsteady now. "Every single time." They stayed like that for a long time in the quiet library, surrounded by 7 years of unsent letters, and Winifred understood in that moment that whatever society said about the suddenness of their engagement, whatever Constance Ashby had threatened or Mr. Fenwick had implied, none of it mattered in the slightest against the simple, devastating fact of 100 letters written and never sent by a man who had loved her faithfully and silently across an ocean and 7 years and another man's wedding ring, and had never once stopped. Now, before we reach the end of our story tonight, I want to take a moment to reflect on something, because I think the letters Cedric kept are, in some ways, the heart of this entire tale. We live today in a world of immediate communication, where a thought can be shared the moment it occurs, where distance and time barely register as obstacles to staying connected with the people we love. It can be difficult, from where we sit now, to fully appreciate what it meant in the 1850s for someone to be genuinely and completely unreachable, not for days, but for years. A letter to India might take 3 or 4 months to arrive, if it arrived at all. A response might take just as long to return. For someone like Cedric, separated from Winifred by an ocean and by circumstance and by the simple, immovable fact of her marriage to another man, there was no possibility of a quick word, a brief reassurance, a way of simply checking in. There was only silence, and the choice of what to do with it. He chose to write anyway. Knowing the Avhor letters would never be read, knowing they could change nothing, knowing that by every reasonable measure they served no purpose at all except to occupy a drawer in a cabinet on the other side of the world. And yet he wrote them, because I think some part of him needed there to be a record, however private, however useless, that what he felt was real and ongoing, and not simply a passing fancy that time and distance would eventually erase. I find something quietly remarkable in that. Not the grand gesture, not the dramatic declaration, but the quiet persistence of it. The choosing, again and again, across years, to put something true into words, even when no one would ever read them. I think that says something rather profound about what love actually is, when you strip away all the performance of it. The wedding took place on a clear, cold morning in late November, at the small church near Marrowfield, where Winifred had been christened, and where her father had served as vicar for 30 years, a detail Cedric had arranged without telling her, simply presenting it as a fact one morning with the particular careful casualness of a man who hoped a gesture would matter as much as he intended it to. It mattered enormously. The church was full, not with the fashionable crowds who had spent weeks gossiping about the engagement, most of whom had not been invited and would not have come if they had been, but with the people of Marrowfield itself, the elderly parishioners who remembered Reverend Hartley with genuine affection, the families whose christenings and weddings and funerals he had presided over for 3 decades, the woman who had once been Winifred's nursemaid, weeping openly in the second pew. Cassandra was there, of course, beaming, and Margaret, who had finally, after weeks of anxious hand-wringing, simply decided to be happy for her sister, and wept nearly as much as the former nursemaid throughout the entire ceremony. of Constance Ashby and Mr. Fenwick, and the fashionable society that had spent 2 months speculating about scandal and impropriety, there was no sign at all, and Winifred found, standing at the altar in the small church where she had been baptized, in a gown the deep grey blue of a winter sky rather than the white that would have seemed somehow too loud a statement after everything that had come before, that she did not miss them in the slightest. When Cedric placed the ring on her finger, a simple band, nothing ostentatious, which he had told her, with a faint, almost shy smile, had belonged to his own grandmother, a woman by all accounts considerably more interested in books than in jewels. Winifred looked up at him and saw, in his eyes, the same expression she had glimpsed on that terrace weeks ago. Not the cool, controlled composure he showed the world, but something raw and unguarded and entirely hers. "I love you," he said, so quietly only she could hear it, before the vicar had even finished the words of the ceremony. "I have loved you for 15 years, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain you never doubt it again." "I know," Winifred whispered back, smiling through tears she made no effort to hide this time. "I have 100 letters that prove it." Mr. Fenwick made one final attempt at the Hawthorne townhouse a week before the wedding, arriving uninvited, attempting to present himself as though nothing at all had passed between them, his card already extended toward the footman who answered the door before he had even finished announcing himself. The footman did not take the card. "His Grace is not at home to Mr. Fenwick," the footman said, with the particular flat finality of a servant repeating an instruction he had clearly been given in advance. And in front of, Winifred could not help but notice from the window above, no fewer than 3 of Fenwick's own acquaintances, who happened to be passing on the pavement at precisely that moment, and who did not trouble to hide their interest. "Nor," the footman added, "is he likely to be at any time hereafter." Fenwick stood on the step for a long moment, his face working through several expressions before settling on something like fury, and then, visibly aware of his audience, turned and walked away with as much dignity as a man could manage while being watched by people who would, Winifred had no doubt, be discussing the moment in drawing-rooms across Mayfair by evening. He did not call again. And in the months that followed, his shipping interests were subjected to an increasingly unfavourable series of insurance assessments, nothing that could be traced to any single source, nothing that anyone could call deliberate, but enough, cumulatively, to see his fortunes decline steadily until he quietly removed himself from London society altogether, taking up residence, it was said, somewhere considerably less fashionable than Mayfair. The story of how Constance Ashby's family's conduct came to light did not, in the end, require any newspaper scandal at all. Cedric, true to his word, never made the threat public. But word travels in society, regardless of whether anyone intends it to, and within months the whispered story of how the Ashby family had quietly settled an old debt by arranging the marriage of a 19-year-old girl, and had then spent years treating that same girl with contempt for a circumstance entirely of their own making, had become, in its own quiet way, just as damaging as any public exposure might have been. Invitations to the Ashby household grew sparse. Old friends found reasons to be otherwise engaged. Constance Ashby, who had spent her life believing that respectability was a fortress no one could breach, discovered that the foundations of that fortress had been considerably less solid than she had imagined, and that the woman she had spent years dismissing as of no consequence had, without lifting a finger against her, become someone whose displeasure carried rather more weight than her own ever had. And Winifred, who had spent 6 years as the poor widow Ashby, pitied and dismissed and quietly erased from the consideration of everyone who had once condescended to know her, found herself within a single season transformed into the Duchess of Hawthorne, received everywhere, courted by the very women who had once crossed the street to avoid her, and treated by all of London with the particular deference reserved for those whose position could no longer be questioned. She found to her own quiet amusement that she did not much care for most of it, but she cared a great deal for the small, quiet evenings spent in the Hawthorne Library, surrounded by books and firelight, and a man who still even now looked at her sometimes with an expression of faint disbelief, as though he could not quite credit his own good fortune, as though some part of him still expected to wake and find it had all been a dream. "What is it?" she asked him once, catching that look, some months after the wedding, as they sat together by the fire, her head resting against his shoulder, a book open and forgotten on her lap. "Nothing," he said, and then, after a moment, "Everything. I spent so many years writing letters I never sent, to a woman I thought I would never have, and now—" He pressed a kiss to her hair, his arm tightening around her. "Now I find I have run out of things to write, because there is nothing left unsaid between us. I find I rather like it." "You could write to me anyway," Winifred said, smiling against his shoulder. "I should like to receive a letter from you just once that you actually intend to send." He laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, the kind she had heard so rarely from him in those early weeks, and now heard often, every day, in their quiet life together. "Very well," he said. "Though I warn you, Duchess, after 7 years of practice I have become rather good at it." And he kept his word. The first letter arrived the following morning, delivered not by post but by his own hand, placed beside her breakfast plate with the particular shy formality of a man presenting something that mattered to him. And Winifred, opening it, found inside not declarations of love, which she already possessed in abundance, but something simpler and somehow more precious. A small ordinary account of his morning, his plans for the day. A question about whether she might like to walk in the garden later, when the frost had cleared. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of letter a man writes to someone he expects to see again that evening, and the evening after that, and every evening, for the rest of his life. She kept it. She kept all of them. In time, a growing collection of small ordinary letters, kept not in a locked cabinet as a private record of longing, but openly on her own writing desk, where they belonged. Proof, gathered day by day, of a love that no longer needed to hide, and never would again. Thank you so much for being here with me tonight after our little break. Every view, every comment, every moment of this community means more to me than I can easily put into words, and coming back to a story like this one, after some time away, has reminded me exactly why I love doing this. If this story moved you, I would love to hear from you. Tell me, what was your favourite moment? Was it the letters? The terrace? I confess the letters undid me a little, even writing them. If you haven't subscribed yet, I would be so glad to have you here for the next story, and there will be a next one very soon. Until then, take care of yourselves, and I will see you soon.